I wrote this piece based off of some characters from the Stormlight archive series by Brandon Sanderson. The particular two characters it's based off of are Kaladin and Syl, and they're two of my all-time favorite characters from any series. If you've not read any of the books in the series, we're first introduced to these characters in the first book, and that would be Way of Kings. And when we first meet Kaladin, he's a slave, and you don't quite know his past, but you get to know his past and how he got to this place as the book goes on. And when we first meet him, he's very distraught. He has very little hope. He has very little reason to want to live. He's suffering from depression. He thinks about suicide. And it's this sense of hopelessness and this terrible state that Kaladin is in at the beginning of the book that I wanted to capture at the beginning of the piece. The theme isn't then supposed to sound particularly light at the beginning. It's supposed to sound somber. It's supposed to sound very, very stretched out. There eventually gets to be a point where Kaladin just doesn't think he can take any more, and this is where the other character, Syl, who has been around, but she's not particularly prevalent at this point, this is when she kind of makes a difference in his life. The best way to describe Syl for anyone that's not familiar with the series is that she's kind of like a fairy. She's something called a spren. At the beginning of the story, Syl doesn't really have sentience, and she's starting to maybe gain sentience as the story continues on. So she's very childlike, she's very curious, she doesn't quite understand, but she can sense sadness in Kaladin, and she sort of becomes this little glimmer of hope. This is when, in the piece, we get the first high notes, the really high notes in it. And these very first few notes from her are supposed to also be somewhat of a question. So it doesn't sound like a statement, doesn't sound like a demand. It's supposed to be very curious. And then you hear Kaladin's part in response. It's a call and response kind of between the two of them. And then that's kind of when they really connect and the tone of the piece starts to shift. Kaladin is definitely a character that is always very reflective, and he doesn't necessarily forget the things he's gone through, but I think he learns how to become strong because of those things. And so what I decided was I didn't want to completely change the melody, I just wanted to take the darker, more somber themes from before and now make them sound more triumphant. To do that, I no longer had the notes stretch out and be really long in his voices. There's more movement to them. They're deeper, but the articulation is strong. And through all of this, Syl is there. She and him develop such an awesome bond. Ugh, they're like the best duo ever in books. But she's gonna be there, and you hear those high notes kind of soaring throughout the ending part of the piece. It was really, I thought, important to not necessarily write out every single little movement of hers because she's very free, and I wanted that to be reflected in the piece. So a lot of the little ornamentations you'll hear up high, those are improvised. The name of the piece was actually really hard for me to decide, but I think for those of you that have read it, you'll, I think, be on board with this name. But the name of the piece I decided on Life Before Death, and the reason is because those are some words that hold some significance to these characters, and I think it's also a pretty good representation of this piece of music also. It really is such an amazing book, and these characters are so amazing, and they're so fleshed out, and they feel so real, and I just felt so moved by the story, by Kaladin's story, and by their relationship. So if you've not had the chance to read this book, I know it's just giant. It's a massive tome, but it really is such a great story. I think Kaladin is such a good example of, even though he's a fictional character, he really does show what the human spirit is capable of. And for those of you that have read the story and love these characters as much as I do, I hope that you enjoyed my depiction of them through my, this piece of music. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching, and if you're interested in learning more about Way of Kings, I do have an in-depth non-spoiler book review for it. I'll link that over here. Thanks for geeking out with me, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.